This video is sponsored by the new Only Crits Kickstarter campaign. We are in the middle of a golden age of TTRPGs. D&D just launched its new edition with what I think is a pretty good trio of books, but we also have a bunch of other awesome games coming out that are iterating on what D&D and other tabletop games have done so well, learning from the lessons of previous creators and culminating in this mass explosion of creativity. And also, as a result, it feels like we're getting a new wave of tie-in games that were given the license to adapt beloved franchises like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Invincible, Alien, Fallout, Doctor Who, the Marvel Universe, Hellboy, Witcher, Leverage, and so many more. I've picked up some of these games, I am actively planning to run a few of them, but there are so many more out there that I've only heard about and that I'm very keen to check out when I get the chance. However, whenever you're sitting down to play a licensed RPG and it's time to create characters, you have to figure out how your characters are going to fit into that world. Do you want to play as the major characters we're all familiar with? Or do you plan to create new characters who exist in the margins of the stories we already know? Matt Colville touched on this topic in another video, a long time ago, where he basically laid out the different options available to us.
And one of the things I learned when I was working at Wizards of the Coast, they did this huge market survey that no other company in that category has ever been able to afford. And they asked role players a bunch of questions about existing intellectual properties, existing settings. They listed a whole bunch of, let's call them settings, including stuff like Harry Potter and Dune and Robin Hood and King Arthur and Star Trek. And they said, if you're interested in playing a game in these settings, do you want to play the classical heroes or do you want to make your own heroes? Do you want to go through the classical story or do you want a new original story? For instance, do you want to play Robin Hood and his merry men or do you want to play your own original characters fighting the sheriff? Or do you want the battle between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham to be the backdrop of your campaign, and you and your characters are pursuing different interests and may meet the Sheriff of Nottingham, they may meet Robin Hood and Little John, but they are not the principal actors on the stage. And the fascinating thing, especially to me, who ended up working on the D20 version of the Dune role-playing game, was that the same people, your players, had different answers to those questions depending on which setting it was. In some settings, they wanted to play Luke Skywalker and they wanted to fight Darth Vader. In other settings, like for instance in Dune, they loved the idea of being kind of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in the Tom Stoppard play. And the idea that Paul is out there and the conflict between Paul and Baron Harkonnen is going to happen, and they are going to play other actors on the stage working for Paul and being kind of his agents. That was fascinating to me. I would have assumed that everyone would have answered the same way and that there was a right answer, but there's not a right answer. So your players may want to be the ones who save the world. They may want to be the ones who go on the quest to throw the ring into Mount Doom, or they might want to be the ones that are adventuring in the world with other actors on the stage trying to defeat Ajax the Invincible.
I would give anything to be able to read the results of that survey because I think that would be fascinating. And especially I'd love to review the responses and see if I could find any patterns. Like when respondents say that they want to play as existing characters, does that have to do with how many times that story has been retold and adapted? Are people more interested in playing established characters like Robin Hood and King Arthur and Wolverine who have been interpreted in lots of different ways? Whereas for games based on a more sacred texts like Dune and Lord of the Rings, where there's really only one or two really beloved adaptations, do they prefer to play side characters in those worlds? Now that's purely a theory. I don't know because I don't know the results of the poll. Maybe it's even the other way around. Maybe it depends on how many spin-offs have been told in each world. Maybe it depends on the age of the players and whether they came to the hobby through wargaming. Like, do they prefer to play existing characters because they've played miniature war games where they reenact historical battles, so they're more inclined to reprise existing roles and try to iterate on existing stories? I think we could learn so much from that data. But ultimately, I guess it's not that important for us all to know what is true about the larger trends in the hobby. After all, we're not actively working on adapting these franchises into tabletop RPGs. We're just sitting down to make characters for a cool campaign where we're going to play one of these role-playing games based on a franchise we care a lot about. So the better question is, when you and your fellow players sit down with one of these games, like the Firefly RPG or whatever, what does your group want to do? What sort of characters do you all want to play? All of these games will give you the option to create your own characters. And in fact, some games are very clear that you really can't play the iconic characters from the source material. In the Avatar Legends RPG, you get to choose which era you're going to tell stories in, who the current avatar is, but the game doesn't really want you to play familiar characters like Aang or Katara or Mako. On the other hand, you have games like the Marvel Multiverse RPG or the Batman Gotham City Chronicles RPG, where you can create new characters, but you can also definitely play as pre-existing characters. In fact, all the pre-made adventures for the Batman RPG pretty much assume you're going to play some specific canonical characters. You can obviously make your own characters instead and jump into those adventures that way, but the game is very open about the fact that you can play existing characters and it's not an issue at all. But also, If you do want to run an Avatar game where someone in the group is playing Aang or Korra, well, it's your game. When you're playing with your friends, you're not sitting at the table with anyone from Magpie Games. You're not going to get an angry phone call from Brian Konietzko or Michael Dante DiMartino. You're not going to get your books confiscated by an employee of Nickelodeon Group, a subdivision of the Paramount Media Network's division of Paramount Skydance owned by the Ellison family. You can do whatever you want. So I think it's worth sitting down and talking through the pros and cons of each approach for creating characters in established worlds. Because your answer to this question is going to depend a lot on your personal feelings about this fictional world and this franchise as a whole. It's generally pretty easy to get a group of players to agree to make new characters, but can you get everyone in your group to agree to play existing characters? And do you want those characters, whether pre-existing or brand new, to play through classic stories or brand new stories? This question has been on my mind a lot recently because last year I backed the Batman Gotham City Chronicles role-playing game, and I got my copy earlier this year, and it basically reactivated my Batman hyperfixation. In fact, as I've been reading the game and trying to imagine using these rules to play a Batman campaign, I've been diving back into the franchise. I've been watching some of the Batman movies and cartoons and dipping my toes back into reading Batman comics. In fact, as I was scrolling through Kindle and seeing what comics were available, my finger slipped and I purchased 50 issues of Detective Comics for about $100. Oops. Well, what can I do about that?
Yeah, my finger slipped and I purchased 50 issues of Detective Comics for about $100. Oops. Well, what can we do about that? Can we refund the purchase? Yeah, $99.50. Christensen, C-H-R-I-S as in Sam, T as in Tom, E-N as in Nicholas, S as in Sam, E-N as in Nicholas. Yeah, back on the same card is fine.
Yeah, I don't have $100 to drop on comic books right now, but maybe someday. Someday. But as I've been digging into this game, I really want to run it, and in fact, I might be cooking up a Batman campaign, and I'll talk more about that some other time. But the campaign is going to depend a lot on what sort of characters my players want to make. Are we going to be playing as Batman and the Bat Family, or Commissioner Gordon and his detectives, or brand new characters, either superheroes or cops? Like, who do they want to be in this world? So that's what we're going to talk through all the options and walk through why you might favor one approach over another. And just don't be surprised if I reference Batman several times throughout this video. But no matter which type of character you're playing as and what sort of stories you're playing through, you're going to need some dice. And lucky for us, Only Crits is currently running a Kickstarter campaign to create an incredible line of fuck dice. So let's hand this video over to our Only Crits spokesman.
Hello there, Winnie the Pooh here, and I'm here to tell you about our sponsor, Only Crits, who are in the final day of their new Kickstarter for fuck dice. But what even are fuck dice, you might ask? Well, these are the dice that say fuck you on a 20 and fuck me on the 1. So when you roll the dice and you get a critical success or a critical failure, they truly capture how you feel in your heart. And there are also some dice that say fuck for the 1 and yeet for the 20, and some other dice that say 0 on the 1 and hero on the 20. So if you don't want to play a character who cusses, you could still get dice that capture your character and celebrate their success, and tease you for your failures. But the team at Only Crits didn't just make these dice as a goof. These aren't cheap little novelty dice. They're made with all the same care and attention you would expect from the incredible team at Only Crits. They've got sharp-edged dice, dice that look like gemstones or glass or cracked marble, dice with eyes floating in them, and so much more. And they've unlocked some gorgeous dice sets like the Astral Override dice. So make sure you visit the Kickstarter at the link in the description and back the campaign to get your very own set of fuck dice. And thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. Cheerio!
Now, the first option we're discussing today is the scenario where you and your fellow players are taking on the roles of these iconic characters from the source material. You and your friends are Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Princess Leia, or your avatar Aang and Katara and Toph, or you're the crew of the USS Enterprise. And I think most of the time, if you're playing these familiar characters, you're going to be going on brand new adventures that either take place in between the stories we already know, or after them. Basically, you'll be doing the equivalent of what happens when a franchise puts out books or comics or cartoons or audio dramas that take place in between or after the major installments everyone already knows. You're just saying, hey, these characters are neat. I want to play these characters going on more adventures. Now, maybe some players make brand new characters. That's fine too. You can mix and match. Not everybody has to play an established character. But the point is, at least one or two players in the group are playing pre-existing main characters from the franchise. For example, in the Batman RPG, a lot of the official adventures assume you're playing existing characters like Alfred or Commissioner Gordon or Batwoman or the Birds of Prey. It's fine if some players make original characters that can work alongside them, like instead of playing Harvey Bullock or Renee Montoya, you want to make your own cop characters instead. but a lot of these adventures sort of assume that at least some of you are playing some pretty famous characters from the source material. But you can do the same thing in your own games. You can play classic characters going on new adventures, maybe involving classic villains, or maybe inventing brand new ones. It's up to you. One thing that's worth discussing is how you're going to treat the existing canon source material. For example, the Batman universe generally has a pretty straightforward status quo. There's not a ton to worry about there. But if you want to play Luke and Han and Leia, are you telling a story in between the original trilogy movies, the Orig Tridge? Are you telling a story that takes place after the Orig Tridge but before the sequel trilogy? If you play the Witcher RPG as Geralt and his bard buddy, which adventures are in their past and which ones might be in their future, if any? If you want to play Avatar Legends and play Aang and Zuko and Katara, will your campaign take place during the series, or after, when they're adults in their 20s and 30s and they're going on adventures and fighting evil villains and, one assumes, just having the freakiest three ways of all time? Just figure out where you're fitting your story into the existing narrative and how much you're worried about trying to follow canon. Maybe you want to play Luke Skywalker, but you didn't like The Last Jedi, so you don't like the idea that he's one day going to become old Luke from The Last Jedi. You don't want to feel locked into that eventual fate for that character. Well, that's fine. I mean, I think old Luke rules. I like his storyline in The Last Jedi, so I don't really get it, but I don't have to. It's your game. You can play Luke from any point in his past and say, hey, we're not heading towards that same canonical ending for this character. His journey is going to go wherever it goes. In fact, that's probably just a good thing to discuss in general. If you're setting a story early in a character's timeline, or at least earlier than the last time we saw them, then make sure you and your fellow players and your game master talk about this. You need to know whether you're trying to drive the character towards their destined ending, or if you're okay with their ultimate fate changing if the dice decide that things are going a different way. But speaking of the dice potentially changing things, well, what if you actually want to play through these classic stories? What does that actually mean? If we're playing Robin Hood and his merry men, then I'm very open to the idea that we're fighting the Sheriff of Nottingham. After all, I don't know that story super well, other than just the vague idea of the status quo of Robin Hood versus the Sheriff. And so I think any GM could throw a lot of really inventive surprises our way. And we could basically react in real time and make plans to try to defeat the Sheriff or take down some of his forces or strike a public blow against him or whatever. And we would have a lot of freedom within that story. On the other hand, if we're playing in Middle-earth and we decide to play as Frodo and Sam, or we're trying to get the ring to Mount Doom, well, I know which path they took in the source material. I know what twists are in store for our characters. I know my favorite Sam lines that I would want to slip into the game whenever I got the chance. So it would be a lot tougher for me to get on board with playing those characters because I'm too close to the material. It's one of those sacred texts where there have really only been one or two retellings, but they're really, really good. And generally, they follow all the same story beats. Something like Robin Hood has been reinterpreted lots of different ways, so I feel less confined by that premise. But I think the idea behind this approach in general is that you have to treat this campaign as an adaptation. After all, even if you and your fellow players and your GM really try to hit the exact same narrative beat for beat, just the way you remember from the original story, well, the dice are going to overrule you. They're going to introduce some element of randomness, and that's going to change the story a lot. So you really do have to accept the possibility that things might just shake out differently this time. There's actually an actual play podcast called Film Reroll. I've listened to a few episodes, and it's a really fun premise. Each episode has the players playing the main character of some famous movie, but between the players' choices and the dice rolls, sometimes the stories go in some wildly unexpected directions. Would you and your fellow players be comfortable with that happening? Or would you prefer that the main story beats you're all familiar with definitely took place, and so instead you're just telling new stories with those same characters? Of course, one undeniable potential downside of playing existing characters in the first place is, well, your idea of what that character is like might not line up with everyone else's at the table. And again, this is a scenario where you all need to agree that this is an adaptation, and the player who's playing Luke Skywalker or Captain Kirk or Batman has the freedom to play that character however they choose, even if it doesn't line up with your preconceived ideas for that character. Listen, I have strongly developed opinions on what makes a good Batman characterization. But at the gaming table, if I'm not the player playing Batman and someone else is, then none of my opinions matter. It's not my job to police someone else for not playing their character the way I would. But if you don't think you'd be able to restrain yourself if someone acted out of character in your favorite franchise, well, say so during Session 0. Let your fellow players know. Let your game master know. Maybe the best move is for nobody to play these existing characters at all, and everyone should just make new ones. After all, most of the time when people sit down to play any role-playing game, players assume they're going to be able to make new characters and go on new adventures. That's true even in a role-playing game set in a famous franchise. Players still want to make their own characters. But even this idea can still be broken down into two separate scenarios, and those are both worth discussing. The first is where you're playing new heroes, but you're playing in the margins of existing stories. All the familiar story beats are playing out, but we are all playing previously unseen side characters, either reacting to the fallout of the main story or doing side quests to help further the main story. Matt Colville referenced Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is a play that follows two minor characters from Hamlet as they run around in the background of the story. Some of you are probably more familiar with another adaptation of that same concept, The Lion King 1.5. However, probably the best example we could look at, for our purposes today, as an example of this kind of campaign in a pre-existing franchise, is Rogue One. In that movie, we follow a brand new cast of characters as they go on this mission to help the rebellion, and then ultimately they wind up going after the Death Star plans and getting those plans into the hands of the classic heroes. You can absolutely run a Star Wars campaign where the players are running around and trying to get all the material that the heroes have in the main storyline, all the intelligence or the weapons or whatever that we see the main characters use in the movies. Now, one potential pitfall of this sort of prequel-style approach is that if you fail, then the main events of the movie can't happen. If you're playing through a story like Rogue One and you fail to get the Death Star plans, well then, what does that mean for the story of Star Wars? I think you have two options here. You can either play through another mission where another group of characters have to go get the plans and send them to Leia again, or you just create a brand new canon where the timeline goes very differently because you failed. But again, talk to your fellow players and make sure you're all on the same page. But I think what nobody wants is for the GM just to say, it's okay, Leia still gets the plans somehow. No? We're like 4 days away from the Battle of Yavin. That was the scenario of the campaign that we were just running. And we just tried to get her the plans and we failed. There have to be consequences to that. However, this approach could work if you add some more distance between the events of your campaign and the events of the canonical story. On the Campaign podcast, a Star Wars actual play, the party accidentally got their hands on the Death Star plans. This came out way before Rogue One did. And so they wanted to pass these plans along to the rebellion whenever they got the chance to do so. But the story was also set 15 years prior to the Battle of Yavin. So if our main characters fail, well, we know there's still plenty of time for those iconic heroes to get those plans. So we haven't completely broken the canon. Likewise, if you're playing in the Dune universe and you're leading an army working for Paul Atreides, then that war is big enough and long-running enough that you can have a full campaign play out, both a campaign in the role-playing game sense, like a series of adventures, and in the military sense that we get that term from, like a campaign in battle. You can have a campaign in a particular arena of war on some specific planets. And if you fail, well, we know Paul can send more resources to that fight if he needs to. There would be consequences. Other resources would have to go, more soldiers would have to come and fight and die in this arena. But failing one mission, or a couple of missions, doesn't mean that a whole famous movie or book just can't happen, the way it does with failing the mission in Rogue One. The Clone Wars kind of work the same way. Honestly, any war story lends itself really well to this approach. We know the general ending of the war, but most of the fates of the individual characters are ambiguous enough that you can run a full war campaign and your players can have successes and failures in your particular arena of war, and those victories and failures can have consequences, but a lot would need to go wrong before you're at risk of derailing the main narrative. And we don't have to stick with exclusively war. I think this approach in general works really well as long as there's a little bit of buffer in between you and the main events. Playing characters in the margins of existing stories also means that the iconic heroes of this world can make appearances when it feels appropriate. You don't want to do it too often, and you don't want it to be too easy to reach these famous heroes, otherwise you risk damaging the stakes of your story pretty severely, and we'll get to that in a second. But also, it is pretty fun to cross paths with these iconic heroes from time to time, because your missions overlap with theirs. There's a comic book called Gotham Central, where we follow the cops who work in Gotham City as they try to solve the crimes in the world of Batman. And some of these stories are explicitly about the tension between the cops trying to solve crimes their way and having to call in Batman for help because they can't handle one of his supervillains all by themselves. And if this was a RPG campaign, if you were playing street-level cops in the world of Gotham City, then Batman would just be an NPC. But if your players can just flip on the bat signal and call him in for help on every single adventure, then that's going to damage the tension of your story. On the other hand, he is a helpful NPC who obviously exists in this world and would want to help you whenever possible. It would be very tempting just to ask him to step in anytime the players get stuck on anything. And you know, not for nothing, but it would be a fairly faithful adaptation of the source material for the cops to just say, screw it, I can't figure out this riddle, let's call Batman. But it wouldn't make for very rewarding gameplay if you're playing those characters. So that would be the tension that we would have to navigate if we were players in that campaign, and it's something that the Game Master would need to keep in mind as well. We need to keep an eye on that and make sure that we're not running to that well too often. And it's possible every player at the table has their own preference based on the stories they prefer in this world and the stories they prefer as players, and those might not always align with each other either. So we need to talk it through and make sure that we're all on the same page. How much are we going to involve the main characters? How often do we want that to happen? And how much do we want to try to come up with reasons why we're going to try to solve these problems ourselves? Because it is at a certain point going to be on us to make sure that we have a justification for not flipping on the bat signal. Gotham Central does that a lot, where the cops say, no, screw it, this is our case, we're going to solve this without Batman. Sometimes it's because their jobs are on the line, other times it's because it's personal to them, and other times it's because they just don't like Batman. There's reasons you can find, and hopefully you find reasons that can sustain you through most of the campaign, so then when you do need to call him in, it actually really feels impactful the way it should. But there's one last approach that might be right for you and your group, and that's just to carve out your own little corner of the fictional world, one that's relatively untouched by the major events of the main narrative, and just do whatever you want over there. In the Marvel Universe, this would be the equivalent of running games set in, like, Chicago instead of New York. There's not a ton of heroes or villains out there, and you can essentially craft your own campaign. If you want to cross over with other famous heroes or villains, you still can. Maybe you visit New York for a session, or someone from New York comes out to Chicago for a single adventure. It can be done. But you don't have to worry that you're going to be tripping over any of those characters on your day-to-day adventures. You don't have to worry that the iconic heroes are too accessible, or that your player contributions to the world will break the main canon, because you have some distance to tell your own story. You're not locked into the margins of the main narrative. You're just telling another adventure in this larger universe. One of my favorite examples of this approach came in The Mandalorian Season 1. We were following a brand new cast of characters, disconnected from the main narrative. No cameos, no references to future events, just the perfect example of the kind of campaign I've played so many times in established worlds. I prefer The Mandalorian Season 1 to even something like The Force Awakens, especially in an RPG setting, because I like the freedom to just play in your own little corner of the sandbox with brand new characters going on brand new adventures. You can fold in all the stuff you think is neat about the world, whether it's incredible locations, or loose ends, or Easter eggs, and you can link your character to existing lore, or even make them basically a clone of an existing character. Or in the world of Star Wars, you can make them literally a clone. But you're still telling a new story in this world, and you don't really have to worry about how this fits into the broader canon because it's so disconnected. Part of the reason I don't like Season 2 of The Mandalorian nearly as much is because it ends with this giant reminder that we are still in a prequel, as Luke takes Baby Yoda with him, and now we're going to wonder, okay, how we get him back, because we know he's not still going to be at that school when Ben Solo kills all those students. That's not going to happen. So now, all of a sudden, we're operating within the margins of a larger story instead of having our own freedom to tell our own tale. And I'm not saying that you can't make that transition and have an adventure or two that are more closely tied into the main narrative, and then go back into your own world for the rest of the campaign. I think the story of The Mandalorian wound up getting derailed for quite a few reasons, but in theory this could have worked very well. You still have an iconic main hero appearing briefly, helping out the party, and then leaving. I think my main problem with The Mandalorian example was, okay, well, I actually have lots of problems with the Luke Skywalker scene, but for the purposes of today's video, my main problem was that it was not easy for the story to move on from Luke. He was still a major character the next time we came back to this story, because based on the way we left things with him, he kind of had to be. He was very much still involved. This is kind of why, in a world like Star Wars, I much prefer setting your adventures in an untouched corner of the setting, or at least one where you have a lot more freedom, and why it's better to keep any main character cameos to a minimum. When you deliberately set your story out in the uncharted regions of the world, or within familiar locations but not during those big canon events, well, then you're basically just treating the setting like any other campaign setting, with all of the freedoms that come with that. You just take advantage of all this lore about the world and use that to build your characters, while the GM uses that to build your campaign. And you're not too locked into the canonical future of any major events or characters. But it depends a lot on the setting. Like, in Gotham City, I don't really mind the fact that we're running into Batman or things like that, because we have these less canonical stories, this less of a canonical endpoint like we do, I think, with Star Wars. Because honestly, the worlds of Marvel and Batman already kind of function like a D&D campaign setting. You know, we have all these important NPCs out there, and you have to figure out how involved you're going to be with them. But you don't have the same, like, series of events that you're trying to navigate. Whereas in something like Star Wars, we have the movies. Where do you set your story in comparison to the movies is a big question that you have to answer. You don't really have to worry about as much with Marvel or Gotham. Like, in Gotham City, I don't really want to set my adventures in an untouched corner of that world. What would it look like? Just a different city, like Bloodhaven? That's not why I'm playing the Gotham City game. But if that idea excites you and you want to play in a corner of that world that hasn't been nearly as fleshed out, then go with God. That's the point. Of course, whenever you play a game in any pre-existing campaign setting, there is one more potential challenge you might need to overcome. What do you do if you're invited to play in a role-playing game set in a pre-established setting, but you don't know the world? This has actually happened to me several times as a player. I played several Warhammer 40k RPGs, don't know anything about Warhammer. I played the Dragon Age RPG, don't know anything about Dragon Age. Even when my group played Unknown Armies, it became super clear to me that the world of that game was a huge part of what made my game master so excited about that system. and I didn't know anything about the world. Now, hopefully, the game itself and your game master will do a good job of giving you the information you need to create characters and figure out how you fit into the world. But part of the problem of going into an unfamiliar campaign setting is that it just doesn't mean that much to you. When I played the Warhammer RPG, I kind of got the appeal, right? I didn't know much about the lore, but at the very least, I understood the tone, and I understood what made this world unique and exciting to so many people. When I played the Dragon Age RPG, well, I just wasn't seeing what made this world all that different from a typical D&D world, but with less of a variety of monsters. Now, I don't assume that my friends just all love a terribly designed world or anything like that. Instead, I just assumed that I was not getting a good sense of what made this world unique and cool. But as a result, I created a character who could have easily belonged in any fantasy world. She didn't really have any strong ties to that setting. I still had a lot of fun, it was an enjoyable campaign, and I really liked the dice system a lot. But I didn't really understand what made this world unique or interesting, because I didn't know as much about the world as my fellow players did. However, I would also never try to discourage anybody from playing in any fictional world they're not familiar with. After all, you could absolutely say the same thing about some pre-published D&D campaign settings. There are hundreds of thousands of players out there who sat down to play D&D one day without knowing anything about the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk, and they still had a great time. Sure, there may be a lot of pressure when you're entering a world that the other players are very clearly passionate about because they've seen the movies or read the comics or played the video games. But you could say the same thing about the players who love the Forgotten Realms. They might have a lot of strong feelings about that setting. They might have really strong opinions about the lore. It might turn out to be a whole thing, actually. But at the end of the day, they just want you to have fun. I might be particularly critical about the way the Forgotten Realms campaign setting was presented for new players in 5th edition, but that doesn't mean that nobody should ever run new games in that setting. That would be a crazy thing for me to suggest. And sure, because Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms are so closely associated with D&D, those worlds are a little bit clearer about how to play a character in that world. The moment you make a D&D character, they kind of fit very neatly into that setting. And when you sit down to play a game in the Forgotten Realms, nobody's looking at each other wondering who's going to play Drizzt or Minsk. Most people know they're going to be playing their own original characters, and any famous characters of that setting will only appear as NPCs. So you can contrast that with the Hellboy or Batman RPGs, where you could play existing characters if you wanted to. But really, playing in any established campaign setting is basically the same. The hope is that the rulebook will tell you everything you need to know to make your own character. And if you don't know the source material well enough to play an existing character, then just invent a new one. Honestly, that might be the thing that helps you determine whether or not you're going to play an existing character or a new character. You just might not know anything about this setting, so you really wouldn't feel comfortable playing an iconic hero. And that's fine. Just make up your own.
Greetings, influencer.
Oh, what is this now?
I am Mr. Know-It-All, the new master of Gotham City.
I've never heard of you. Are you from the new Matt Fraction Batman run? Because I haven't really been keeping up with the Batman comics for a while now. I'm pretty far behind.
I'm an original character, influencer. You said we could create the kinds of characters you always wished you'd seen. Well, that's me.
Oh. Okay, so you represent the players who don't know that much about the lore of a world. That makes sense.
Oh no, it's quite the opposite. I'm an expert on all things Gotham.
Wait, but what does that have to do with this video? Aside from showing me that you can make an original villain, which you can do in the Batman RPG, you can make an original supervillain. That's pretty cool, but other than that, how do you help me represent the final thoughts of this video?
Oh, that's not why I'm here at all. No, I'm here to play in your Gotham City campaign.
Oh, well, that's great news.
And my job is to point out everything you get wrong about the setting.
You monster. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. There was one more thing that I wanted to talk about. I couldn't figure out exactly where to fit it in, but when you're playing in an existing world like the Star Wars universe, and you want to play a side character who's not like one of the main load-bearing characters of the franchise, like your Luke and your Leia and your Han, when you're playing like a new character, they could still be a pre-existing character who we just haven't seen a lot of. A perfect example of that might be Kumail Nanjiani's character from Obi-Wan, from the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, because that is a character who we've only seen in, like, what, 2 episodes of that show? And they're a really interesting concept. He's a con man who pretends to be a Jedi. That's kind of fascinating. What would it look like if you took that character and you spun them off into their own adventures? And you could play them basically as if they're a new character, but they have some roots in the franchise already. So that's another way you can create a new character who's not totally new, but you're freed of all of the burdens of playing a pre-existing main character like we talked about in the first half of the video. So that's something to think about. You know, there's variations on all this, there's exceptions, and of course, as the Marvel Multiverse game spells out very explicitly, you just play a multiverse version and you're fine. Like, at any point you can just say, yeah, I want to play Captain America, but I don't want to worry about whether or not this is him from a certain point in his timeline or what. I'm just playing one from a different universe, so it's cool. I can just decide what's canon and what's not. He doesn't have to have gone through all the same adventures that we've seen before. This is another one from another universe. Maybe you want to play a Batman RPG where everyone plays Batmans from all the different universe. That would be fun too. But let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite fictional world? And if you were making characters to play in that world, who would you play? Would you make an original character? Or would you try to play as an existing character? There are some other challenges with that approach in terms of mechanics. We didn't touch on that at all in today's video because we're going to talk about that some more in some upcoming videos. Don't worry, we will get to that. In the meantime, make sure you like, subscribe, ring the bell. Make sure to watch this video right here. It is all about how to make your characters really central to the campaign and make sure that they matter. It's great advice for game masters. And the next video is going to be kind of a sequel to that because we're going to be talking a lot about, well, Batman. There's a lot of Batman in that video. There's a lot of Batman in the next video. Hope you enjoy. Until next time, play fair and have fun.